I remember reading this IMDb review of the film 2 Years at Sea by Ben Rivers, which is a kind of contemplative quasi-documentary that follows the daily life of a hermit living in a remote area of northern Scotland. I have no idea why I was even reading IMDb reviews, but this was a very negative review that described the film as a series of long shots where nothing happens. And while I may disagree with the sentiment of this review, the thing is, this person isn't completely wrong. 2 Years at Sea is a film composed almost entirely of long, drawn-out shots showing an old man's daily routine. And so to some degree, it is true that across the film's 90-minute runtime, nothing really happens. But this got me thinking, because I wasn't bored by the film at all, so obviously I was entertained by something. So the question is, what exactly? If nothing is happening, what are all of these scenes made of? What are they doing? What are they showing? Is it even really possible to make a film where, quote-unquote, nothing happens? Of course, when we say that something is happening in a film, what we're really referring to is the story. We're talking about the plot developments, the forward momentum of the narrative, the sense that all of this is leading somewhere and that every scene contributes in some way to the journey and arriving at that eventual destination. And it's clear that 2 Years at Sea doesn't do this. It doesn't feature scenes that advance the plot. It doesn't really have a plot. We don't know where we're going in this film. But surely, even in a film virtually devoid of plot, something is always happening on screen, literally, even if it may seem insignificant, even if we're not paying attention to it because it's, well, just boring. So the next question is, what would a film that takes these simple happenings, these insignificant events, as its sole content look like? And what would even be the point, the artistic value of a film like that? Well, the first name that comes to mind is James Benning, a director whose filmography is perhaps closest to embodying the expression like watching paint dry. And I say that affectionately because Benning's artistic project is one that really resonates with me. His films are mostly composed solely of extremely long shots of various landscapes, allowing for only as much movement or action as the landscape itself happens to offer us. And so he's the poster boy for a certain kind of filmmaking that would make a certain kind of audience say, how is this even a film? It's just a bunch of long shots where nothing happens. Of course, Benning's answer would be that actually a whole bunch of stuff is happening if you pay attention. Why do we have such a hard time just seeing, just appreciating the discrete happenings of the image and soundtrack?
My work from the very beginning has always been invested in looking and listening, and I've always believed that to learn anything it takes time, and that means that one has to practice paying attention. And so my works provide that experience for an audience where they can pay attention to things. That's the kind of attention all art demands, really, that you pay close attention and give to it, and not like entertainment that gives to you and you don't give much to it, and then you leave the experience and it disappears quite quickly because you really had no intellectual response to what you've seen or participated in. But if you're actually participating in it and working hard, and I think one has to work hard when they go to my works, even though I think by the end, if you do, it's enjoyable. It shouldn't be painful, but sometimes learning is painful, and it takes some time to understand that. And then once you get back past that, I think it gives back quite readily.
These are films where we sit patiently, or not so patiently, waiting for something to happen, only to miss what is already happening right in front of us, a stream of sights and sounds. These films take these kinds of happenings as their primary subject matter. Rather than imposing a narrative on the image, shaping the image, they challenge us to discover within the image whatever narrative there might be. A passing train, the interplay of light and shadow on a tree, the gradual metamorphosis of a cloud in the sky. To these filmmakers, these are all worthwhile cinematic events, potential objects of observation and appreciation. Do we really need plot to organize these images, to render them subservient to narrative, in order for us to be entertained by them? Benning's answer is no. His art is all about insisting that we can truly see and appreciate what is right in front of us if we just try. No surprise then that Benning is a student of Henry David Thoreau. In his Two Cabins project, he even recreated exactly Thoreau's cabin from Walden, as well as a replica of Ted Kaczynski's cabin, which was also based on Thoreau's. He even made a film featuring this cabin called Stemple Pass, which is composed of 4 segments, each taking place during a season of the year, similar to the structure of Thoreau's book. There's a passage in Walden in the chapter titled Sounds that could be seen as a thesis statement for Benning's cinema. Thoreau writes, "What is a course of history or philosophy or poetry, no matter how well selected, or the best society or the most admirable routine of life, compared with the discipline of looking always at what is to be seen? Will you be a reader, a student merely, or a seer?" Benning's is a cinema of seers. Obviously, it's not hard to find a connection between Thoreau's time spent living in the woods and his ideal of simple living, and the life of the hermit Jake Williams, seen in 2 Years at Sea. Ben Rivers' approach, however, differs greatly from Benning's. First of all, there's very rarely anything resembling a character in Benning's work. Landscapes are usually the main focus. And I say character because while Jake Williams is a real person who really does live as a hermit in Aberdeenshire, 2 Years at Sea isn't a straightforward documentary. Ben Rivers went beyond the simple act of observation and collaborated with Williams to construct scenes, sometimes rehearsed, that would not be completely out of the ordinary for the hermit's routine, but might not be something he would have actually done without the presence of the camera. So the end result is a kind of blend of fact and fiction. In one interview, Rivers states that, "I wanted it to be more like cinema, move further away from an idea of documentary by shooting in cinemascope and not having any dialogue. I've had this lifelong love of science fiction, and you could also see that in some way. 2 Years at Sea could be like a post-apocalyptic movie. I like books and films about the last man on Earth, and it could easily be read like that." But just because Rivers wanted to veer away from documentary into the realm of fiction doesn't mean that 2 Years at Sea really resembles conventional narrative cinema in any way either. He goes on to say that we've all been taught over the decades that the cinema will provide plots and the necessary information to know exactly what's going on. Then, of course, there's a whole area of cinema that fought against this passivity on the part of the audience and asked for heightened engagement of the imagination or other vital parts of the brain which can also be temporarily disengaged when watching plot or action-based films. And this is the kind of cinema that has influenced the films I want to make. This idea of the heightened engagement of the imagination of the viewer brings us back to what Benning is trying to accomplish in his films. That idea that the film is also about what the audience is willing to bring to it. And I don't mean that in the sort of cliched sense that the work of art is this blank slate onto which you project whatever you want, but rather that you have to give yourself over to the experience of the film, despite how difficult it may seem at first, and only then will what is actually there right in front of you reveal itself to you. We might say that the less is happening in the film, the more is happening in the mind of the viewer. We go from a passive audience to an active audience who participates in the construction of the meaning of the film. And so what is the viewer constructing when they watch a film like 2 Years at Sea? Well, for me at least, I find that we spend so much time with this one character in this remote environment that we can't help but, consciously or not, fill in the gaps of his life. We wonder, why did he choose to live this life? Who exactly is Jake Williams? And I think Rivers even seeks to provoke these kinds of questions in the mind of the viewer by showing the hermit contemplating old family photos, or at least what we assume to be old family photos, painting the portrait of a man turned toward the past, a theme that will be very important as we move on through these films. Rivers writes that with a lot of my films over the years, I've been interested in spaces and objects as a way to build a portrait of a person, an understanding of who they might be without that straightforward telling. So that's the strategy for 2 Years at Sea, to give the audience these clues to a past. There's still plenty of room to decide who the person in that photograph is, or where an object or a piece of music comes from. I like the idea that you don't have to know all the answers, and it's fine not to know. You're still getting a pretty intimate view of someone, but it's a moment in time. The rest of it you can think about because you're never going to find out everything about a person. Even if I made a really straightforward documentary with loads of talking and everything explained, you're still never going to know the person. These photos then become like the film itself, pictures without context, snapshots of a life lived, the contours and gaps of which are filled in by the audience's imagination. One way to make a recommendation video is to compile a list of films in accordance with a given theme. A list of horror films, a list of hidden gems, a list of the best Japanese films of all time, something like that. Another way to make a recommendation video is to simply wait until a number of films have gathered together almost organically over time, creating their own set of associations as if in orbit around a shared theme, but one that remains a mystery even to you, such that the work of the video becomes not the straightforward task of composing a series of short paragraphs that introduce the chosen films and explain why they may be of interest to the viewer, but rather becomes an attempt to understand what exactly brought these films together in your imagination in the first place, in the hopes that in the end you will grasp what that shared theme, that organizing principle actually was. Or who knows, maybe there isn't really anything that connects the films, maybe it was just a vibe, something that you can't quite verbalize or explain. I'm writing this right now knowing which films I will be talking about, but not yet knowing how I will talk about them. The rest of the video is yet to be written, and while I do have a sense that something about these films does justify talking about them in relation to one another, certain commonalities, resonances, vague patterns and textures, the full picture remains unclear. But I'm confident that by following this process, by the end of this video, after the work is done and I have digged as deep as I can into these works of art, the full picture will reveal itself. Helena Whitman took over 2.5 years to complete her first feature-length film, Drift. Not because the film is particularly ambitious, but because Whitman's process was contemplative rather than systematic. She began by filming these scenes featuring 2 real-life friends on a trip on an island in the North Sea. And when one of the actresses suddenly decided to move back to Brazil, this event was organically incorporated into the plot of the film, which thus became an examination of distance, of the space between these 2 women and the time that passes before they eventually reunite in the end. So the final structure of the film, as it exists today, emerged out of the process. We could say that the structure was discovered rather than determined in advance. Perhaps the most striking and noteworthy aspect of Drift is the 30-minute long sequence that takes up the entire middle section of the film and which features exclusively a series of shots of the Atlantic Ocean as the main character sails across it. And Whitman talks about spending days obsessively rewatching whatever new material she had in order to grasp its meaning and potential. She describes her thinking as intuitive rather than conceptual. She even explains how when it came time to edit this extended ocean sequence and actually decide in which order to place each individual shot, she would watch them all over and over again until eventually they spoke to her. And it was only then that she could craft a kind of narrative out of these shots that are, on the surface, completely devoid of any kind of narrative. They're just waves. But this is a different kind of narrative than the one we're used to. This is a narrative made of shapes and rhythms, patterns and textures, an interplay between the concrete materiality of the image and what it shows, and the abstract emotion it evokes and its effect on the viewer. Whitman says that the viewer needs to trust the film, as it becomes an experience only when you are able to surrender yourself to it. In contrast to Drift, which to me felt rather rigid in its visual language and tones, Whitman's most recent feature film, Human Flowers of Flesh, on the other hand, feels more akin to floating aimlessly atop the waves, bleached by the sun. Human Flowers of Flesh feels like a film of fragments scattered in the ocean. And I have to admit that the first time I watched the film, I had a very hard time following whatever semblance of a story there was, because the borders between scenes appeared to fade away, moments melt into one another. I couldn't quite grasp what the plot of this film was, if there even was one. The more I tried to focus on what was happening, what the characters were talking about, what exactly the overarching structure of the story was, I'd just as quickly lose focus. My attention would drift. I'd notice a detail, a play of light in the corner, the particular way the waves glimmered in the sun. And this is by design. Whitman's films are, to some degree, about the protean potential of the image, its materiality, and I think this is why she likes filming the ocean. The film that gave me the idea of making this video in the first place was Yang Chao's Crosscurrent from 2016. It was one of those films that I just happened to throw on, knowing virtually nothing about the film or its director, just because it looked like exactly the kind of thing I was in the mood to watch at that moment. And it turned out I was right. There are films like that, films that you have to be in the right mood to enjoy, and I think that Crosscurrent is definitely that kind of movie, which might sound like a flaw, but I tend to like films like that, films that seem almost designed to accompany you in a mood, to extend that mood and carry you through it, almost like the film is gently pushing you down a river. It's a very, very slow and contemplative film, and even the very little plot that is there is hard to follow. I guess that's a common feature of these art house films centered around bodies of water. The filmmakers tend to get lost in the waves, tend to go adrift. A common word found throughout a lot of this film's reviews is pretentious. And I think that's because a lot of people have a very hard time accepting anything that is overtly poetic or philosophical. Anything that veers away from naturalism toward a kind of symbolism or allegorical storytelling. But Crosscurrent is an interesting case because it kind of lands somewhere in between those two extremes. Its cinematography by Mark Li Pingbing, who worked on In the Mood for Love and a number of Hou Xiaoshen films, manages to create an extremely tactile visual texture, one that feels very real. But the narrative itself, on the other hand, the storytelling, is profoundly poetic. Quite literally, the film features a series of poems written by the director that actually show up on screen at different points in the journey. So through this blend of realistic, almost documentary-like images and the poetic narrative throughline, we get a film that genuinely feels like it's extracting poetry from real places, discovering the symbolism in the landscape rather than imposing it onto it. And you can tell that this film was born from a genuine, deep understanding and familiarity with the Yangtze River, which isn't surprising given that the crew spent months on the river during production. In the film, there's this kind of double movement of the river flowing out toward the sea and of the main character sailing up toward the river's source. The double movement of time flowing ever forward and of those looking back upon history. This is the conflict that the filmmaker finds at the heart of modern China and its industrial development. As someone who spends a lot of time writing and thinking about art, about various media, I find that I quickly grow tired of the conventional ways of talking about said media, of analysing and critiquing art. And that's all the more true of the way we talk about art on this platform, on YouTube. Over the years, certain forms of criticism, forms of video essays have become ossified. So I'm always searching for novel approaches, novel methods, and one that I've come to appreciate is that of not really establishing a thesis, an argument that drives and shapes my research, but instead simply finding something specific that interests me. It could be a particular work, a particular artist, or a more general notion or observation about a medium, and then just digging into that topic of interest and following wherever the rabbit hole leads me, through whatever web of associations happen to emerge. It's kind of like recreating the structure and flow of a train of thought, going off on tangents, looping back around to previous points, just deepening the overall picture little by little. If we were to get a bit pretentious about it, I could compare it to Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the rhizome. It's about a kind of faith in the process, I guess. Not seeking to follow a rigid, predetermined structure, just collecting fragments of insights, following those little sparks of inspiration wherever they lead you, and then at some point being satisfied with the work, putting it together and presenting it as this kind of fragmentary collage that will lead the viewer through an entirely singular and original series of associations that in the end will give them a new perspective on the topic. New and original because it's your perspective. It's a train of thought that no one else would have had. But it's also a matter of just making the most of the creative freedom that this platform affords us. What's the point of making YouTube videos that just sound like articles or academic essays, or even worse, Twitter threads? Maybe we should be searching for new ways of talking about art that can only be done in this medium, because it's clear at this point that YouTube is a distinct medium, that there is something special or different about this platform. People are willing to sit through 5-hour-long video essays on topics they've never even heard of before. People want to be led down a rabbit hole. People want to lose themselves in someone else's perception of the world, someone else's monomaniacal research. People are willing to go on a journey without knowing the destination. If Yang Chao's Crosscurrent finds poetry in the Yangtze River, then Lois Patiño's Red Moon Tide instead retrieves myth from the shores of Galicia in northern Spain. In an introduction written for the film, the director writes that Red Moon Tide was a project where I wanted to explore and mix two lines, one formal and the other thematic. One with the cinema language and the other with the reality I'm portraying. Here that reality was the Galician culture, the rich, mythical and legendary universe of Galicia, very connected with the beyond and the dead. The two most important beings of our fantastic imaginary are a procession of phantoms called Santa Compaña and a kind of witch called Mega. This was my main interest in Galicia in this film, to reflect on this mysterious relationship with death and the dead people of Galicia. Something that I ended up relating with the fact that Galicia was considered one of the endings of the world before America appeared in the European imaginary. So Galician people have been living for centuries with a very dangerous and mysterious neighbor, a never-ending Atlantic Ocean, or worse, an ocean that ends in a huge abyss. One Spanish philosopher explained it very nicely, making a comparison between the land and a theatre. Finisterre, Ireland, Brittany, our Galicia, Portugal, the first islands in the ocean, deep down in their souls, the immemorially acquired panic, at the time when these lands were on the edge of a sea to whose extension no limits were attributed. A proscenium box is not occupied with impunity in the great theatre of mystery. Patiño compares his work to French writer and mystic Romain Rolland's concept of the oceanic feeling, a term he coined in a letter to Freud, which he describes as a feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, of an indissoluble bond, of being one with the external world as a whole, and which he sees as the foundation of the universal religious experience. It makes sense then that Patiño would be interested in recreating this feeling in a film that deals explicitly with the mythical foundation of a region. The idea of feeling or being dissolved through a revelatory or spiritual moment in the energy of a landscape. That's an experience that I try to offer to the viewer through contemplation. Another typical starting point for me is to reflect on the identity of a landscape, how it is built through the layers of overlapping history and myth. An interesting definition of landscape is the one that says landscape is a strata of time condensed in an image. But also, certain landscapes evoke certain myths and legends. There aren't the same myths in the desert as there are here at the coast with a dangerous sea. The identity of a landscape arises from a constant back and forth between the people and the landscape. In Red Moon Tide, there is a stillness. Characters do not act, they tell stories, they reflect, they mourn. It is the feeling of arriving at the end of history and realizing that nothing comes next. All they can do is repeat over and over, waiting for something to happen. A place where time is as cyclical as the tide. The event has become myth. When nothing happens and history has come to an end, the difference between a day and a century is meaningless. Last and First Men is a science fiction novel by Olaf Stapledon, published in 1930. Acclaimed as one of the most epic sci-fi stories ever crafted, it tells the story of mankind's evolution over 2 billion years, describing the various human species that are to emerge in the future. This is the novel that composer Johan Johansson chose to adapt as his first and, as it turned out, his last film. Despite the grand scale of the original novel, the film adaptation is incredibly minimalistic. Johansson chooses passages of narration from the novel in which the last human species attempts to communicate a desperate message to present-day humans and plays them over a series of shots of various monuments and sculptures. These images of empty landscapes populated only by monuments allude to a time after man, after history. It shows us what we will leave behind, what will remain of us. a calming stillness in the wake of the chaos of mankind's history. These sculptures are dominated by circular shapes that harken back to the novel's cyclical view of history, in which each human civilization rises to great heights before inevitably falling back into savagery. I think that Last and First Men would make for a really good double feature with the last section of Gakuryu Ishii's Tokyo Blood, which is an omnibus of 4 short films mostly dealing with characters feeling trapped in Tokyo's urban landscapes, except for the final short, which is a massive departure from the rest. Similarly to Last and First Men, in Heart of Stone we find a series of shots with virtually no human presence, illustrating a time after mankind has moved on, evolved into a new form of existence. Here men have uploaded their consciousness onto computers in order to avoid a strange disease that turns humans to stone. Both of these films, as well as Red Moon Tide, evoke this feeling that the whole world is behind us, all of human history slowly fading away, leaving nothing but a great wide expanse ahead of us. They create this kind of post-historical time that the viewer is brought to inhabit. These are a different kind of film where, quote-unquote, nothing happens.
人間はもう100万年もの間、その肉体は変化しておらず、脳の形も10万年間ほとんど変わっていなかったそうです。たとえ石化病が発生してなくても、すでに人間は進化の歴史を終えた生きた化石だったのです。
Seeing as we started this video with 2 Years at Sea, I thought it would be appropriately circular to end with another Ben Rivers film, my favourite of his in fact, a short film called I Know Where I'm Going. From its opening shot of an abandoned car covered in snow to its final images of black trees against a night sky, I Know Where I'm Going instills a similarly apocalyptic atmosphere to the previous films we've discussed. But if those films could almost be called post-apocalyptic or post-historical, we might say that this film is pre-apocalyptic. It gestures toward a coming end to our world, but remains fixed in the present, an anticipatory present. It too asks the question, what will remain of us when we're gone? I know of few films that manage to blend so effectively a foreboding feeling of inevitable doom with a kind of optimism. Not exactly hope for the future, but an acceptance of whatever may befall us. But what's certain in I Know Where I'm Going is that we're standing at a precipice.
So if we apply the same rules to human beings that we as human beings apply to trilobites or ammonites or anything else, we can then get some measure, not quite cosmically, but at least on a planetary scale, of what we are and where we fit in, and what we have done fits in the grand scale of things. Are we a minor blip in the history of the planet, that when we disappear then it'll be like Ozymandias in the desert, being taken apart, destroyed, and the jungle takes over, and then there's nothing left, the evidence is gone? Or are we something really quite big in geological terms? Have we altered the Earth enough to leave an indelible signature written into the strata of the planet?
All of the films that have gathered here to be discussed in this video, in their quiet contemplation of the shapes and patterns and textures of the world, evoke a strange feeling, sometimes foreboding, sometimes confounding, a feeling that we, the viewers, are drifting slowly toward the edge of the world. A place where narrative comes out of joint, loses its shape, and leaves only the image, films that find in this simple act of observation and contemplation a deeper sense of time slipping away. Perhaps when you stare too long at landscapes, at empty spaces, mankind inevitably starts to recede, and you begin to imagine a world without the eyes that perceive these places, a world after man. The question they pose is our relation to the outside world, to the stillness and indifference of landscapes, one of self-annihilation? There's something that Luis Patiño talked about in one of his interviews that I read that really stuck with me because it relates to something I've been thinking about for a while now, concerning the question of what exactly it is that we get out of art, or at least what it is that I often value most in art. He said this: "As an artist, you are obliged to try to push cinema to new ways of showing and telling. Every medium is infinite. There is so much to explore. As Dominique Noguez said, another way of showing will bring another way of thinking, and it's needed to rethink reality from different perspectives." And so this is exactly what attracts me to art. Its ability to, in a sense, unlock or reveal a certain state of mind or mode of thought, a territory of being that previously went unexplored and that we might never have discovered if it were not for this strange alchemy of this particular medium. And maybe criticism can do something similar, offer different ways of thinking about art and our relation to it.